Alright, so we ended the last lecture covering animal language, and now we're going to continue on the same topic, the idea of just the foundations of language, but move on from whether or not animals have language and sort of the way language is developed to the more bases of language. We're going to cover biology, social, and cognitive bases for language. So all of these go together in this sort of idea of the different ways that language happens either in the brain or in the individual, which is sort of moving on from development of language actually becoming a thing. Okay. So we use localization, so lesion studies, fMRI, so magnetic resonance imaging, where we can localize or figure out where the areas of the brain are that do language. Lesion studies are when someone has a stroke, or we can look at people who have brain damage for other reasons, concussions, and the last type of brain thing that we can do is an EEG, but it doesn't really give us a space, it gives us time. And we use that to study where language happens in the brain. So hemispheric-wise, we've talked about this a little bit, but most right-handed people, it's in the left hemisphere, usually in Broca's and Wernicke's, here at your temple and then back behind your ear. For most left-handed people, it's about half and half. So you'll see that they will get activation on both sides for Broca's, so left and right hemisphere. Anytime someone has an aphasia, that's a disorder of language where they have some sort of loss of language, where we're losing the expressive language, I can't speak it, or receptive, I can't understand what's coming into the system. Anytime we have a syndrome, it's a cluster of symptoms that tend to have an underlying cause. So aphasias are sort of specifically dealing with sending and receiving of language, where syndrome is there are different things that can happen, such as we could have problems understanding language, but also problems naming things. And it's a cluster of things that tend to have an underlying biological cause. Okay. So 2 videos for you to be able to go and watch, both examples of types of aphasia. So Broca's is an aphasia. It's called as non-syntactic, I've totally forgot. But anyways, it's when people have slow and laborious speech and have difficulty in articulation. So when you break Broca's area, you can't think of what you're trying to say. So Broca's, remember, is what do I want to respond with? So people have a really hard time responding, but their responses at least make sense. So when they do answer a question, the answers are at least semantically appropriate. However, it's very difficult, and it's also very frustrating for people. Wernicke's aphasia is when you have problems in the back here, and people don't understand what people are saying to them. So I always joke that everything sounds like Charlie Brown. They know people are talking to them, and they're trying to process what those words are, but you can't. They can't tell you what any of the words mean, so their answers back don't make any sense. So sometimes Wernicke's aphasia gives you what people call word salad, which is the same phrase they use for schizophrenics, because it's just like they took all the words and tossed them together. So remember, Wernicke's aphasia is non-fluent, which I've always found to be exceedingly weird because fluency is about syntax. So with Broca's, Broca's is non-fluent. So with Broca's, there's no syntactic structure. There's usually just nouns and verbs. It's kind of like children speaking. With Wernicke's, the syntax structure is correct, but the words that are filled into those syntactic structures don't make any sense. So there's no meaning. So the way I think about Broca's is that it still makes sense. With Wernicke's, it no longer makes sense. Both of them we have word finding difficulties, mostly because that is controlled by usually the parietal or temporal lobes, and it's just like those pieces that want to say what they're trying to say can't connect to the dictionary where it has the list of words that are appropriate for them to say. So we're talking about the Geschwind-Wernicke model, sometimes called Wernicke-Geschwind, so people flip them back and forth. In the book, it puts Wernicke's name first. It doesn't matter, as long as you get the idea behind it. So here are some primary pieces with Broca's here in the front and Wernicke's here in the back. There's two other important components, the motor cortex here in the middle, because the motor cortex is the one that plans the action to be able to speak. So in the last section, we talked about how to pronounce words, and earlier we talked about gesturing. All of that happens in the motor cortex. So what they think happens is if I'm hearing a word, so let's say I hear somebody say my name, and I try to pronounce it back. What happens is it comes in the primary auditory cortex here through my ears and the temporal lobe. It goes through the arcuate fasciculus, which I cannot pronounce to save my life. That has way too many vowels and C's at once. But this little piece here, and that's just the roadway to Wernicke's. In Wernicke's, I'm processing and I'm understanding that someone said my name. Then it goes forward to Broca's. Broca's formulates the response. Okay, I want to repeat that back. The motor cortex is where the planning and the action happen. So it starts here in the auditory cortex, goes back to Wernicke's, goes forward to Broca's, and then through the motor cortex. If I want to pronounce something, say something aloud after reading it, which is different than hearing, it starts here in the back in the visual cortex. So your occipital lobes here in the back. It travels through the angular gyrus, which is an area that handles the coordination between these areas. Hits up Wernicke's, and then the path is nearly the same. It goes through Wernicke's to Broca's through the motor cortex. So it adds an extra step because it's going from vision to pronunciation instead of just hearing to pronunciation. And that's what most of this says here. See, the book has it switched, but hearing, it starts in the auditory cortex, it goes to Wernicke's. We translate that sound into an object in Wernicke's. And then it hits the arcuate fasciculus to Broca's. Broca's, we pick up the articulation rules in the motor cortex, and then we actually speak. Okay. In newer models, so that's one of the older models, and that's pretty well supported that that's the kind of path to speaking after hearing or reading. But some of these newer models include some things that we've learned since then. Which is information about prosody, so the rhythm of language. We are rhythmic language, that's a syllables thing. And visual word recognition. That tends to happen in the right hemisphere. So there's another model called Ullmann's DP model for declarative procedural. Declarative system is the mental lexicon. That's your fact knowledge. That's mainly in your temporal lobe. So remember, temporal lobes kind of... we got frontal, parietal, temporal here, kind of by your ears. It's a little underneath the parietal lobe. And that's on both sides of the brain, but it's actually predominantly on the right. So this fact-based system is important because it pulls up the dictionary definitions for words. So we're pulling in the meaning of those words as we are hearing or reading. The procedural system is where grammar is based, and that's more frontal. So your frontal lobes, your cerebellum's not in the front, brainstem underneath, but Broca's. So a lot of action happening in the front. I think that grammar system and procedural memory about what the order of words is and where words can go is sort of based in the front. Okay. And so Ullmann's model really pulls in the sort of theoretical components to language, whereas the Wernicke-Geschwind model is very biological. And so that model pulls both of those together. So it takes what we understand about memory systems and adds language to that. Because language and memory systems can't really be separated. You can try, but you still have to have memory of what the words are and the grammatical rules, although those should be so well known that it's difficult to talk about them. So the good thing about these newer models is that they're trying to make better cover the way that we actually work. But in Ullman's model, there's a big distinction between the rules and the words, which is something that we do day to day, as well as our understanding of words and grammar is kind of separated from each other. So, in switching thoughts here from the actual brain and where things happen in the brain, let's talk about another biological basis, which is gender. So, big stereotype about language is that women are better at language and men are better at math, says the statistics woman teacher, right? And there's this really famous stereotype that women talk more than men, which is a total and complete lie. That research has not been supported. It was horribly biased. Women are more likely to have jobs that require them to talk more. But if you take those things out or control for types of work, women don't talk more than men. Men like to yap just as much as we do. So what are some things that are supported? In general, women tend to talk before boys, like in the development span, about a month before. We do tend to have better verbal and visual memories, better reading and spelling. But that might be because of social pressures, right? So we always have to acknowledge the fact that these are stereotype threats, but it's not really a threat, stereotype bonus, I don't know what to call it, where you're expected to be better at these things. I can't spell to save my life, cannot spell, okay? But there is some research that shows that women use both cortexes for language processing, which may explain why these better visual and verbal memories, because you have more brain action in on the game, so to speak. Boys are better lateralized, and they tend to be more right ear dominant, which means they are, remember, it's all controlled by the other side of the brain, so that if you're right ear dominant, you're processing more with your left hemisphere, which is where language is. So there are some small differences between guys and girls, but they're not huge things, and a lot of these are often also explained by social pressures. So the last sort of biological thing we're going to cover is critical periods. And critical periods are really great at pulling together this nature-nurture and this emergentist idea that language is environmentally based. So we kind of have Chomsky on one side and Skinner on the other, and then if you don't want them to be behaviorists, you've got famous researchers like Tomasello who argue that language is emergent, so it's part of your environment. Okay? So critical periods are the thing right in the middle. So a critical period is a biological time point that certain things have to happen genetics-wise and environment-wise for something else to happen. So there's a time period when hemispheric specialization happens, and there's lots of plasticity. So the brain is really moldable. And if you don't have specific types of linguistic events during that time period that the specialization is occurring, you won't be able to learn language at a full level. So there is a critical period to be able to learn language. So I have to have that biology and genetics happening and development, that sort of thing. And I also have to have these linguistic events, which basically means people are talking to you, you're hearing language, you're interacting with it. So I have to have both the biology and the environment for language to develop naturally. Okay, so any genetic defects, injuries, those can slow the genetic component, so the environment component may or may not help you catch up. But then also if you take away the environmental component where people aren't talking to you, genetics isn't enough. So this is the one thing that really allows us to see that it is not all nature and it's not all nurture. Okay? So some evidence for this critical period idea. Lateralization occurs as you age. There is plasticity after damage. And so we always jokingly tell people if you're going to have a stroke, you should do it early in life, which is a horrible thing to say, I think, except that strokes don't tend to happen early in life. But if you're going to have some sort of brain damage, earlier is better. If you can avoid it, please do. But car accidents, hard contact sports, that sort of thing, is that we tend to have some plasticity. So if I break Broca's area, which is here on the left side, if I break Broca's area, I can reroute the language components to the other side of the brain and use the same component on the right side. And so what you'll see is like there's an area of the brain that's considered dead because of whatever. The other areas of the brain will start lighting up to take up, to make up for that damage. So there is some plasticity after damage. And then there's a couple of ideas about lateralization. So lateralization is where we tend to see left hemispheric dominance for language, right hemispheric dominance for spatial cues. And there's a couple of different theories. So equipotentiality, which is just too many syllables, is that the hemispheres are the same at birth. So they could both get language, and then it's just sort of the luck of the draw. And I think if that hypothesis were true, what we'd see is a 50-50 split where some people have it on the right, some people have it on the left, and it's not tied so heavily to handedness. Sometimes there's a theory of irreversible determinism, so sometimes it's called the invariance hypothesis. And that's the idea that the left is set aside at birth, but right will take over if there's damage. It doesn't totally explain left-handed people. And then the emergentist account, where it's a combination of two different things. The brain has a preference for the left hemisphere, but we can be plastic if necessary. And that's probably the most accurate view, is that there's this preference for the left, but there's also this interaction with your environment, where that's where handedness will help. Not help explain, but whatever it is that causes that might also push preference for the right side or both sides. So we have to find a way to explain left-handed people somehow, and I would like to know too, being lefty. So with this critical up period idea, this brings in the issue that people have learning a second or more languages. So everybody knows it's hard to learn a second language, and the best time to learn them is growing up, hearing it as a kid. And so if you are stuck in Spanish 101, 201 right now, and you're struggling, you can blame your parents, but you can also blame your biology. So a couple ideas on why learning a second language is hard, and that's what this critical hypothesis, is that we're matured past the point of learning it. So old dogs know new tricks. So our ability to learn a language declines with age, so that makes it harder to learn the second language. And then there's the exercise hypothesis, use it or lose it. So unless our capacity to learn languages is exercised a lot, we lose that capacity. And that helps explain why some people say that the third language and beyond gets even easier. So you almost become an expert at learning languages at that point. And both of those hypotheses are fairly well supported, in that it is difficult to learn as we age, and that if we practice a whole bunch, we get better at learning new languages. So if we test those hypotheses, there's a little bit of a strange interaction in that adults actually perform better at learning a second language than children, but they think that's actually due to the fact that adults are better at studying because we have more developed memory systems. We've usually been taught through school on how to study and work on memory, and so adults are better at memorization, but children are better at sounding like natives because they're not set in their phonological development, and over time, children are better at that sort of native understanding of the language. So they get the grammar a little easier, and then the words kind of come later. Whereas adults are better at memorizing the words, and the grammar is a little harder. But our general decline, says maturation hypothesis, in our ability to learn languages is sort of gradual. It's not like you hit age 8 and you're done. It's a slow process. So to switch tracks just a little bit, if we have no input during this critical period, this is the idea that you can't learn language to its full potential. So all of this really goes together, and it seems like a little bit of everything, but what we're talking about here is if I have this critical period, what does that do to me learning a second language? Okay, if I have this critical period and I don't get any input, what does that do to me learning my primary language? Okay. So sometimes these are called feral children. We don't really totally use that phrase anymore because it sounds terrible, like comparing them to dogs. But they often have no language and difficult to learn anything, even with intense training. So some famous cases is the wild boy of Erin. And so there are these other sort of wolf monkey children things. But the most famous case, at least in the US, is Jeannie. So she was put in a closet she was about 2 years old till she was 13 or 14, and she was strapped to a potty chair. It's just all this horrible abuse as well. She had contact with her family, but only when she was fed, and the family actually barked at her instead of spoke to her. There was no noise in the house, and after social services rescued her, she was able to learn some language, never morphology, so never this idea of changing words to become something else. So cat to cats, and go to went doesn't count, but walk to walked. And many parts of grammar were really still foreign to her. So the argument was she gained language to be about a 2 to 3 year old. And so that supports this critical periods idea in that the biology was there, but the input wasn't. So there is a documentary on Jeannie, and you can find lots of different things on YouTube if you're interested in this case. Some of the biggest criticisms of this particular case is that there was also a lot of abuse. So it's difficult to tell if it was the abuse or just the not hearing language. I think there are other cases, unfortunately, that support the input hypothesis that you have to be able to hear it as well as have that biology at the same time. Okay. Now, instead of critical periods, a lot of people call them sensitive periods. So we can't accept this full critical period idea because language can still somewhat be learned, even if we talk about second languages. And lateralization may or may not be present at birth. There's a little kind of census is still out on that one. But we can agree that there are periods of development where you're sensitive to learning specific things. So why should we use this phrase instead of critical periods? Well, the nativist explanation, so remember that anytime you see nativist, we're talking about the nature people, is that the brain is sort of pre-programmed. It's ready to learn, to acquire language early in development. The maturational explanation is that as we age and our systems mature, we sort of prune out things that we're not using, and those cognitive advantages and flexibilities go away. So it's actually an advantage that kids are, I'm going to use this, slow. So it's an advantage that kids have less memory, not less memory, but like different memory systems than adults do, because it allows them to take in information in smaller chunks, and it's sort of this less is more idea. It's not overwhelming the system. And so this idea of critical sensitive periods, remember, is half nature, half nurture. And it's pretty well accepted that language is not totally innate, that there is this critical period idea. Hey, don't you start with me today, cat. Right. To cover a little bit of Piaget, so I said we wouldn't do a whole lot of development, but just a little bit here. So we're switching from biological bases, so more genetic DNA sorts of things, brain components, to cognitive bases. So when we talk about cognitive bases, we're talking about just like thinking kinds of things. And so Piaget is actually pretty important. And it wouldn't seem like this would be important for language but I think once we talk about it a little bit, it'll make sense. So with Piaget, there's the sensory motor period, where our behavior is focused around senses and motor systems. And so we have to learn object permanence. So things are there even though we can't see them anymore. If you think about that time period, there's also a leaps and bounds of language development, of learning words for things, understanding, slowly beginning to build categories, understanding that dogs are one thing and cats are another. And so touching is really important, and grasping. So we're learning how things feel and how to describe them, because we're also learning words. And at pre-operational stage, we are egocentric, so we can't take another person's point of view. So if I ask you, what is it that you think I'm seeing beyond the camera, you wouldn't be able to do that because you couldn't imagine my point of view. And so that sort of language focus means that I can't do sort of perspective taking, which is an important part of language. And then we have our concrete operational stage, which is where we can do that conservation task, that really famous conservation task, which is what this link here is for you guys, where you take 2 glasses of water. One of them is fat and short, the other one is skinny and tall, and you ask children to watch you pour from one to the other, and you ask them which one is more, and they always pick the taller one if they can't conserve. So they understand that the concept, the definition of more, which is part of the language system, but they don't understand the preservation of volume. But we can take others' points of view. And then formal observations is where we're able to reason abstractly. So there's more perspective taking, problem solving, that sort of thing. And all of those are tied to our understanding of language. Because if we can't understand the difference between surface structure of words, so the words themselves, and the deep structure of words, the meaning, we most certainly are going to struggle with idioms and abstract sentences, ambiguous sentences. So Piaget's stages kind of actually line up fairly nicely with some developmental stages of cognition, which also line up with developmental stages of language. So that implies that there is a heavy cognitive base to language, which would be just sort of duh, but it also argues sort of against it being totally innate, this little module here. So if it's just this little thing that I can pop in and pop out of the brain, okay, not literally, but if you think about it like as a memory card, and this is language, it doesn't need anything else. Well, that's not true. Our language system is so interwoven with all of our other systems. Sometimes it's difficult to argue that language is totally its own little genetic system. And instead, it is more of a process within this great hierarchy of cognitive systems. So that's really the big distinction here between the sort of Chomsky view that language is this module that's stuck in right here in Broca's and right here in Wernicke's, and pop them out, language is done. Whereas the more emergentist view is that language is just a byproduct of other cognitive systems. So it's just this giant set of RAM, and we happen to have a program called language. So continuing with a little bit of Piaget, so assimilation is our ability to take information and fit it into existing cognitive structures, so we assimilate new words into our language. Whereas accommodation is where our cognitive structures are changed to allow for new information. So when you realize you misunderstood the definition for a word. But if I take this even further back and think about the basis of language, assimilation is this idea that we take this system that we need and fit it into our current cognitive structures. So we've got attention, we've got working memory, whereas accommodation is really probably more likely what happened. We had all this new information and we had to find a way to capture it, to explain it, to make it work for us evolutionarily. And so language was developed as a way to accommodate for the fact that sounds and gestures weren't enough. And so we went through this stage where we were able to evolutionarily only do sounds and gestures, and then it just became too much and we had to accommodate those cognitive structures. So sort of two different ways to think about that. Piaget is talking about children learning categories and hierarchies and just developmental cognitive, but you can also think about it as like a way that language became a thing. So, cognitive hypothesis for language is that there are certain cognitive precursors that have to develop before you can have language. So this is why you don't just come out yapping. So we have to have certain object permanence to be able to gain vocabulary. You have to have working memory and memory systems for a language to really develop. But it's really hard to test this theory because it's not like I can give children no object permanence and then see if they'll develop language, because you can't really turn that on and off, and that's not ethical either. But this is kind of a supported idea in the sense that if you think about autobiographical memories, so memories of your childhood, most people don't have them before 3 or 4. And why is that? Well, a lot of it is you just don't have the systems, aren't developed yet. So your working memory, your memory systems are still developing, your language system is developing, so you don't have an overlay to save that information with. And so these cognitive systems have to develop first for you to really strengthen your language skills. Now, switching on to social basis for language. So we've done biology, cognition, let's talk about social. So for language to develop naturally, we've already talked about the input hypothesis. We have to have some sort of interaction. You can't just leave kids in front of a TV. And many people believe that grammar is actually learned implicitly by these social interactions. So you don't hear a bunch of people walking around saying ungrammatical things. So in general, it's reinforced grammar through these interactions with people. Now, children will say ungrammatical things, but then they get corrected. And so that's the reinforcing the correct version of that grammar. An important part is turn taking. So for a long time, I worked for Relay for the Deaf. So I was a relay operator where deaf people will call on their TTY machines where they type, or hard of hearing people will call where they'll speak for themselves and then you type for them, where since they can't hear over the phone, jokingly it's old lady deaf, but there are people who are hard of hearing who aren't older. And then they also have systems for people who can hear but can't speak for themselves. So that's part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. There is a online version too, but a lot of people used the just the phone system version when I worked there. And one thing that you'll realize that you have no understanding of how well you do naturally is turn taking. So the sort of pauses and the abilities to understand when it's someone's turn to speak in a conversation until you try to use one of these systems. The worst was calling pizza places because they want the information and they want it now. A lot of people who were typing on TTY machine didn't type that fast, and they would like to interrupt a lot, and so you kind of are forced to realize how much you rely on these cues for turn taking, that when they're taken away because they literally cannot do them, how uncomfortable it is. And so we really learn how to use our language in social interactions, and turn taking occurs really at a very early age between mothers and children. So if you watch them interact at the same time, we don't tend to talk over each other. Now as adults you'll do that, but a lot of people perceive it as rude. And so this really is a theory called attentional frame theory. It's by Tomasello. He's one of the big components of language's a learned system that can't be separated from all of our other systems, like social interaction. And it's that at that young age, you're really like sitting with mom. If you're the kid, you're learning the rules about turn taking, about focused attention, where you're both focusing on the same thing, like reading a book together. And that's where children take their understanding of how language is supposed to go back and forth. And you'll see that as an adult if you ever like travel to a new area where they don't have the same rules. And so sometimes people perceive either Americans or Europeans or whoever as rude because when they get excited about something you're saying, they'll interrupt you. And a lot of people find that very discomforting unless you're from an area that's used to doing that. And so if you're really interested in this sort of idea, there's a really fantastic book by Buchanan called You Just Don't Understand that is about these social cues in language and how bad we are at realizing them. And so we just think that the person is rude or that they're just a jerk or whatever because you're working from different language perspectives. Highly recommend. It's a pop psych book or pop social psych book. Very easy to read, super interesting, and it'll really make you think about these social cues in language that you just hadn't even considered before. So last couple little random sections here at the end, but if we talk about, talking about people who are deaf and then people who are blind or visually impaired, so some sort of impairment to a different system, how does that affect language? So being visually impaired to blind or hearing impaired to deaf actually doesn't affect the language system in the sense of like biology, but it does affect the language system overall because of those cognitive structures. Okay? So visually impaired children tend to have slower cognitive development, and so that slows vocabulary development because so much of language is visual. You think language is spoken, but then there's reading, there's those gestures, there's body language, so there's a lot of things that are missing. People tend to use more action words and less nouns and function words. So there are more action verbs, there are less nouns and function words. Phonological development is slower because of our focus on the mouth. So English has very similar phonemes, so things that sound the same, but mouth-wise they look differently. And so we use those mouth visual cues to help us distinguish different phonemes, but if you are visually impaired, you can't do that. Okay. And syntactically, there's more repetition than normal. So the impairment to the visual system affects the language system, which implies that these two things can't be separated completely anyway. Hearing impaired to deaf children tend to gain language at the same rate and have similar cognitive development if they're taught. So one issue that you see with language in the hearing impaired community is that for a long time there just weren't the systems in place in the schools and the ability for lower income families to have access to the right type of instruction. And so with really both types of impairments, they're not disorders, you really it's all about the teaching in those critical periods, and so access to the proper training can really eliminate a lot of these so-called impairments, because some of the issues are just really due to the fact that they, for at least blind people, they can't see the phonemes, so they have to learn in a different way. And for hearing impaired children, they can't have those hearing turn-taking skills, so they need maybe ASL or just the right type of implant so they can hear better. So there's lots of reasons why language appears impaired that I don't think are cognitive impairments and are more problems with our system of training. Okay. So overall, what studies on impaired communities show is that it's not cognitive development that's the problem with the language. It's more of the social interaction. So, if you're hearing impaired in a neighborhood with no one else that speaks ASL, you're just not talking to anybody. And there's also a lot of cultural differences between communities, and so understanding their rules and the social interaction really helps eliminate problems overall. That's like a general rule in life. Like if we could understand each other, maybe we wouldn't be having all these problems. So there's your epiphany for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But it's the social interaction. So this section is in the social bases because it really shows that it's not cognitive, it's social. That's the issue. Okay. And then the very last section, it really gets at this sort of philosophical question of what is the relationship between language and thought. So can we have thought without language? And most people are like, oh, I don't, like maybe, I don't know. So I can speak without thinking, which is never a good thing. And I can think without speaking. So I can think thoughts to myself. And people who can't speak can still think, so they can write. So they can still have language. So clearly there's something about language and thought that are separate things, but I don't know if we can totally tease them apart. Okay. So some theories about language and thought. Piaget said that our cognitive development determines the course of language development. So just basic cognition was the driving force for language. Chomsky argued that language and cognition are totally separate things, which I've kind of just spent 25 minutes saying that they aren't. A new name, Vygotsky. So Vygotsky is that he's more of a social psychologist, but the idea is that language and cognition start as different pieces in the brain, and then they become so interdependent that you can't separate them. So his argument is that language and thought, so anytime you see cognition, you can replace the word with thinking, are sort of separate entities until just the sheer nature of how we interact with the world and the necessity of living, you just can't separate them from each other. And then the famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is that language actually determines thought. So different languages have different thinking. So a little bit more on some other people, some of these new people. So, I misspelled Vygotsky's name on this one. That should be a T. Oops. So, for Vygotsky, speech and thought are different origins in the brain. And there's this pre-intellectual stage where the words themselves are, this is during development, are not really symbols, they're just sounds. So this is from my nephew, whose name is Grayson. The cat's name is also Grayson. That's a long story. But he would say, Grayson, uh-oh, but nothing had happened. So it was clear that he knew these symbols, but didn't understand the meanings behind them. Okay. Early speech is that egocentric speech we talked about with Piaget, and that's to help interactions. And so that egocentric speech really helps children learn the difference between I and you. But that's when thoughts and language are slowly merging together, is that understanding of my name means me, and this symbol means this other person. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which isn't totally supported anymore, but we're going to kind of walk through it, is that the form of the language determines our thought process. This is called linguistic determinism. And so this is the Eskimos have more words for snow hypothesis, which has been debunked. So here's your funny comic for the day. So linguistic determinism is that the characteristics of language determine the way we think, remember, and perceive. Whereas linguistic relativism is that different languages create different cognitive structures, which is really what's causing those differences in the number of words or just perception. And most people accept sort of a weak version of this theory is that language differences affect processing because they're so intertwined together, where linguistic coding is important, but that language itself is not the only determinant of thought. And so this is just the idea that the way things are worded can affect memory, but that is not the only reason that memory is the way it is. It's kind of the idea. Okay. So a little bit of evidence for this is, and then one I don't think I have on there is that we're better at, sometimes we're better at remembering negative events, and so that the way that they're worded, they're coded with lots of knots and sort of negative words, help us remember better, but that's not the only reason the memory system works the way it does. Okay. So some evidence for language determines thought is these different translations of language that sound funny. So the French word for potato is pomme de terre, which is apple of the earth. So do French people think about potatoes differently than we do because they actually are calling them apples? And I'd say probably not. They're still potatoes. So the language here would determine our thought about potatoes, but I'd argue we probably don't really think about them differently. But the idea is that because we have these different ways of talking about the same concepts, maybe we do. The Whorfian hypothesis was that some languages have more words for things than others. So the more words for snow, so they must think differently about them than other languages. That is not well supported anymore. Because if you think about anything, any job that you've had or any specialty or expertise that you have, those vocabulary differences really are reflected because of your experience with the world. So I could probably tell you about 200 statistics words that nobody can spell, not even me. And that has nothing to do with my language being English. It has everything to do with my expertise and practice. So if you think about the lingo behind anything, or I'm recording this now as that new Pokemon Go game is coming out. So if you think about all the different words that you learn in that particular game, that has nothing to do with language. It's not because you're English or you're French or Spanish or whatever. It's because you've gained an expertise in that. So it's about experience, not language. So some more support for Sapir-Whorf, and this is kind of still supported, is these grammatical differences. So gender-marked languages versus non-marked languages. So English is not a gender-marked language, where most Romance languages are gender-marked. So those gender markers are useful when you're determining the sex of something. So fiancé versus fiance. There's lots of different, waitress versus waiter in English, but they're really not very useful for determining things like pencil. And so there's a question of if people who speak in a gender-marked language think about things differently. So are pencils feminine because they are marked with a feminine V or A? And there is a little bit of support for that idea, that they think differently about words in gender-marked languages than non-gender languages. And then, of course, there's an interaction theory. So this is going to be a common theme this semester, where there's one theory, there's another theory, and then there's a theory that says it's both. Surprise! Okay. But there really is a complex interaction between language and thought. You cannot separate them totally. I don't know that language totally determines thought, but it certainly it will influence thought. So some evidence for that is the candlebox problem. Sometimes this is called functional fixedness. It's the tendency to only think of things for what their intended use is. So the candlebox problem is one where they give you a box of matches and a candle, and they ask an attack or two, and they say, light this candle and stick it on the wall. So people try to use the thumbtacks, to stick it through the wax, where they try to like burn the end of the candle and then wax it to the wall. And what you're supposed to do is dump out all the matches and tack the box to the wall and then stick the candle in that. So you're functionally fixed on the fact that that box of matches is matches and not a box that you can use. Okay. And so there are several examples of that in the functional fixedness literature about our thoughts, or the way we think about nouns influences our ability to like use them in a creative way. There's also some evidence that we stereotype based on language. So English, when you hear someone speaking English with the same dialect as you, you assume all of those English stereotypes. And so if you ever go overseas, it's easier to tell them that you're Canadian, because then they don't assume all the American stereotypes about you, right? So, but we do the same thing in reverse when we hear people in the U.S., and that's abundantly clear at the moment that we have this really big issue with stereotyping, but this is stereotyping based on language, although language and culture are often tied together. Some more evidence is number learning in English. English, again, stupid language, right? French, it's like 1 to 10, and then 11 to 20, but then it becomes 20 plus 1, 20 plus 2, 20 plus 3, and it sort of is like an addition problem for a number. But English has lots of different, more, I think, words for numbers than other languages, and that makes it more difficult to learn, especially for second languages. And so they do think that we think about numbers just a little differently because of that issue, right? They think it makes math a little harder as well. Okay? Because if you are trying to learn 25 in French, it's 20 plus 5. So that automatically gets you a little bit more than learning 25 in English. Okay, not the best example because 25 is 25, but go with me here. Okay. So kind of the overall end to this section is that there's a complex interaction between language and thought. I think that's the last slide, yeah. Language is clearly biologically based. Language has roots in cognition, and so it is a system that is intertwined with our cognitive processes, and language is heavily influenced by our social interactions as well. And so there's no good way to separate language and thought, and language is really built on these systems and interactions with these systems and the environment.